live.
Thank you. Good morning. For the record, I'm Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel, and I'd like to call the Agricultural Worker, Labor and Employment Laws Study Committee to order. The first order of business today is the selection of a chair. Are there any nominations?
I'd like to nominate Representative David Durfee as chair.
Okay, there's a nomination. Is it seconded?
Second.
Any other nominations? All those in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, Representative Durfee, the meeting is yours.
All right, thank you, Damian. And is there a second order of business specifically in the act that requires us to pick a vice chair?
You're not required to pick a vice chair. However, it often is helpful to have a vice chair in case the chair is unable to be present. Typically, it's a member of the other house that serves as vice chair. But again, it's not required. So there's nothing in the enabling law that requires a vice chair, specifies who it has to be. I think you could ask if any members of the committee would be interested in serving as the vice chair.
Would any member of the committee be interested in serving as a vice chair in the event that I'm not able to be at a meeting?
I'd like to nominate Senator Brock.
I would be willing to do it if, again, no one else wants to do it. I'll put it that way.
I can't do it, but I'm the low person on the totem pole, so I do serve on the ag committee, but so does Brian Coleman.
Fine, if you'd like to be vice chair, I'm fine with that.
Are there any other nominations for vice chair?
Oh, your motion's on the floor, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if we're seconded.
I'd like to second Senator Renner as vice chair because of what I just saw, but I don't know if
So there's two nominations on the
are
floor.
there two nominations? Okay.
So,
Okay, so we have two nominations on the floor and a second for Senator Renner.
oh, yes, two nominations at this point.
Okay,
So there was a nomination for Senator Brock and a nomination for Senator Renner.
I would like to withdraw from consideration and second Senator Renner.
Okay, there you go.
okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Any opposed? All right, thank you.
Perfect.
All right, we have printed copies of the agenda. I think if everybody has a copy, it's also posted on the committee webpage. And the committee webpage is accessible if you go to on the legislative website. If you go to committees and then to other committees, you'll see a list of other committees that are not the standing House and Senate committees. And on that list is this committee. We also have a number of documents posted there that Damian's going to be walking us through today. And we have some hard copies. If anybody would like to have a hard copy to refer to, take note. If we run out of hard copies, we can get more made as well. So we're here until 3:30 this afternoon. We're going to take a break for lunch and a break. We'll try to take a regular break. So a short break before we get to lunch and then a break mid-afternoon. And we have a pretty full schedule, I think, of background material that Damian has pulled together to help us understand, first of all, what our charge is as a committee, and then background information on labor law as it currently stands in Vermont related to agricultural workers and to other workers. To federal law, we'll be hearing about, I think, other states. Maybe I'm getting too far ahead of myself. Damian, I'll let you jump in. But over the course of the day, I think we're going to have quite a bit of information on both Vermont law, federal law, and what happens in other states too. So turn it over to you, Damian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to give you a sense of what I'm going to be doing this morning, I'm going to start with a short overview of the committee's charge, which will help sort of frame, I hope, your thinking on these issues going forward. So I'll go over the legislation, and we can talk a little bit about what the report might look like and what's expected of the committee. That'll probably bring us right up to your first break at 10:45, maybe even a few minutes early. And then at 11, we'll be back. I'm going to do a brief overview of employment rights for ag workers in Vermont, looking at both the Vermont state law and the federal law, because often they are overlapping, or in some cases, one doesn't cover it and the other does. And so we'll look at how that plays out with some of the major employment laws. I do want to emphasize, though, that it is a very high-level overview. So there are a lot of details and nuances and some lesser laws that I'm just going to have to skip over because we'd be here all day. And then this afternoon, we're going to discuss collective bargaining law. It's scheduled for 2 blocks. The reason for that is that collective bargaining law is, one, it's the primary charge of this committee is to look at the issue of collective bargaining for agricultural workers. And 2, it's just a complicated area of law. And so getting a good understanding of the mechanics there and leaving time for questions, I think makes sense. And then after that, at 3 o'clock, we're scheduled to shift to committee discussion to sort of plan out how you want to tackle the issues going forward. And talk about things like witnesses and sort of a plan for what you want to do at the coming hearings.
Damien, would it be appropriate for members of the committee to introduce themselves? before we start?
Absolutely. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
I-
Mr. Chair.
That. Okay, well, let's do that quickly then. My name is David Durfee. I am from Shaftesbury in the Bennington Three House District. I chair the House Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency and Forestry. Maybe we go around this way.
Sure. Senator Brian Collmore, from Rutland Town. I sit on Senate Ag as vice chair in the morning, and my afternoon committee is institutions.
And I'm Senator Randy Brock from Franklin County and part of Grand Isle County. I'm Senate Minority Leader, and I'm on the Finance Committee and also on the Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs Committee.
Hi, everyone. Irene Renner, Senator for Chittenden North, which is Milford, Fairfax, Westford, and the part of Essex in which I live. I serve also on agriculture and institutions with Senator Collins.
Hi, everybody. I am Representative Ashley Bartley. I live in Fairfax, represent Franklin 1, and I sit on the General and Housing Committee in the House.
I'm Heather Supernut. I represent Windsor 4, the towns of Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater, and I'm vice chair in the House for Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry.
I'm Representative Robin Chestnut Tangerman from Middletown Springs, the Rutland Bennington District. I'm vice chair of the Housing and General Affairs Committee in the House.
Good morning, Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, Senate District Chittenden Southeast. I chair Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs in the Senate, the originating committee of this proposal in S102, and currently sit on Senate Finance in the afternoon. And I will say in advance to anyone watching that you might not see me at the next meeting because my due date is September 6th for my second child. So might not be here depending on when we schedule that next meeting.
We will certainly take that into account when we're scheduling the next meeting, because I think we want to have broad participation as possible. So, and I'll just say thank you to all the members of the committee for taking a nice summer day to be in this room and back in Montpelier. We also have at the table Damien Leonard, who I think has introduced himself already officially. And Megan, did you want to introduce yourself?
Megan Canella, committee assistant for this committee, and a few others here at the State House as well.
Thank you. All right, back to you.
Great. All right, so I'll share my PowerPoint on the screen. And get going. Okay. So, the study committee here was created, in Act 117 this past spring, with the specific direction to examine the application of Vermont's labor laws, and employment laws related to agricultural workers in Vermont, and to identify potential legislative action to provide additional coverage to the workers under those laws. There are 8 of you, 4 from the House, 4 from the Senate. You have elected your chair. 5 or more of you constitute a quorum, so we'll need to keep that in mind when scheduling meetings. You have funding for up to 6 meetings. That doesn't mean you're limited to 6. This means that your expenses will not be reimbursed after 6. So just keep that in mind as you're scheduling through the fall. You have assistance from all of the legislative offices, legislative operations, legislative council are here today. And then if you need fiscal modeling or fiscal testimony, Joint Fiscal is available as well. And then you cease to exist on December 31st, which is just over 2 weeks after the date when your report is due. Typically, December 15th reports are sometimes on time and sometimes a bit late. So this gives you some extra time if you need to squeeze in a meeting before the holidays to finalize the report. So your research duties are to identify the existing employment rights for agricultural workers under Vermont federal law. We're going to do that today, at least the first pass on that. And then identify Vermont and federal employment and collective bargaining laws that do not apply to some or all Vermont agricultural workers. Again, we're going to start going over that today. Identify laws in other states that provide employment or collective bargaining rights to agricultural workers that Vermont workers do not have. We are not really going to get into that today, so that's something for a future meeting. And then turning to collective bargaining with particular attention to states, and I'm quoting the law here, that have agricultural economies similar to Vermont's. Examine the structure of those collective bargaining rights, including the coverage. So who can bargain, which employers are required to bargain, how do they certify a union, what subjects can workers actually bargain over, what are the procedures when they reach a bargaining impasse? For example, do they allow strikes? Do they prohibit them? Do they provide an alternative dispute resolution mechanism? Can the farm just impose a contract? There are a variety of mechanisms that you can go with there, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. What are the unfair labor practices? These are things that prevent the collective bargaining law from functioning. So they're basically violations of the law or rules made under the law. And then how do they address costs related to organizing and contract negotiation? This was a big question that came up this past session. As you're all aware, Vermont has very small farms, and it may be a very, very different landscape than, for example, in Central California or something like that, where the farms would be larger and potentially have more capacity to, for example, hire an attorney to help with negotiations or something like that. So that's a question to be looked at. And then again, same questions for Vermont's existing labor laws. What's the coverage? How do we certify representatives? What are the subjects for bargaining? Procedures for resolving impasse? How do we deal with unfair labor practices? And how do we deal with the costs? Again, we'll touch this on a very high level today. Likely, we'll need to go into it in more depth in the future.
David, are you okay with questions?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is that Damien?
Yeah. Oh, did you ask David, not Damien?
Well,
Sorry.
both, I guess.
I just heard Damien, so.
I thought I heard Damien too. That's fine. But yeah, I think, Damien, if you don't mind stepping in, and Senator Himsdale, if you're trying to ask a question and I don't recognize you, please jump in. And others can help me by looking at the screen and seeing if you're waving a hand or whatever.
Okay, great. I know every chair does it a little differently, so I didn't want to jump in until you said it was okay. But I wrote the report for this bill on the Senate side and then went to the hospital. And so I just need my memory refreshed so that where there are areas where I think there's comparable discussion that may or may not have happened or need to happen. And that's all to ask, did we allow domestic workers to organize and that has passed? And the study only pulled out agricultural workers?
That's correct, Senator. The bill does allow, Act 117 does permit domestic workers to organize, provided they're in a workplace that has 5 or more employees. So that's the limitation on them. But agricultural workers were pulled out in the House because of the variety of questions that came up. And so it was moved to a study committee to sort of look at those questions.
Okay, that just helps me mentally think about areas where if we need to go back and clarify the law for domestic workers too, there might be similar circumstances. So just wanted to refresh my memory.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point too. This may be an interesting dive into some of the employment and labor laws for all of you. And so I always find when I go back through those laws, I try to say, why did we do that again? So there may be questions that come up. I'm happy to answer those questions. I think to the extent that they're not directly related to labor law, I'm happy to answer some clarifying questions, but if you have more in-depth questions, for example, about like the sick leave law or the minimum wage law, I'm happy to spend some time with you outside the hearings too, if we're running short on time, just so that we can, I know we have a lot of ground to cover. But if you have clarifying questions like, how does this tie in? For example, there's a lot of overlap between agriculture and forestry or agriculture and trucking, or agriculture and then people who manufacture food products. And I'm happy to try to weave that in to the extent I know the answers. And in some cases, I may have to go back and research. There are a lot of these laws where it's like one law covers trucking of agricultural goods and the other doesn't. Or one law covers loggers as producers of fiber within agriculture and the other law specifically excludes them. And so that can be another interesting question. And it does bring up when you get to the point of proposing a collective bargaining law, you probably want to define agriculture clearly and specifically exclude things you don't want to include in it, because that is a major potential stumbling block if you get into arguments over, for example, is a logging crew engaged in agriculture or are they engaged in interstate commerce? Because the answer there will either put them under the National Labor Relations Act or under your Agricultural Worker Act. And so to the extent you can have clarity, that would presumably be a good thing and avoid litigation in the future. So just something to highlight. There's a lot of overlap, and the domestic workers was a piece where those two were agricultural workers and domestic workers were moving together and then split. So please do ask clarifying questions like that. So, okay, let me get back. We're almost done with this driest of my presentations here. The next question is, we have a very small Vermont Labor Board. They have 1.5 staff people. And then I believe they have 6 members who are serve on a per diem basis. like many other Vermont boards. So the big question is, if you create a new labor relations law, do they have the capacity to administer it? Or would there be additional costs? Another thing is, do they have the expertise to administer agricultural collective bargaining? There we go. The next is develop a framework for agricultural collective bargaining. This is something you'll have to put in your report. One thing I do want to clarify here is that you're required to develop this framework. You can say, here's the framework that we think would be best, but the committee doesn't support this for the following reasons. Or you can say, but the committee is split on whether this is a good idea. And that's because the law does require you to have a proposal. It doesn't require the committee to support it. So that was something that came out of the negotiations when this language was being put forward in the House. There were split opinions on whether it was a good idea, but there was also a sense that if you don't have a proposal on the table, you're talking in theory rather than about specifics. The next is identify other potential changes to Vermont's employment laws to provide additional rights and protections to agricultural workers. You do not have to draft legislation on those. You could just identify, perhaps you want to include them in minimum wage, perhaps you don't. Perhaps you want to clarify sick leave laws to cover certain types of workers who might not be covered, or family and medical leave, et cetera. And then the report, it's due on the 15th of December. It has to include the proposal for permitting agricultural workers to collectively bargain and a recommendation for any other legislative action, which could be take no action. So that's, and then big thing to keep in mind is you have to agree on the details of the report by your final meeting. However, you can sign the final report after that meeting. What often happens is we hammer out the details of the report in the final meeting, and then it goes through the editing process. And then you have a chance to read it and sign it before the December 31st deadline. If we run past the December 15th submission deadline, there are no teeth in the law if you miss your submission deadline. So no one's going to be coming after you with a fine or something like that. But ideally, we'd get it in by the 15th because of the holidays. Realistically, I'll probably be available through the 22nd and then be dealing with school break and Christmas and everything else with my family. So going to the collective bargaining proposal, the law requires you to look at several specific things. One is whether to include the agricultural workers in the State Labor Relations Act, which, as we'll discuss later, is the state act that applies to private sector workplaces that aren't covered by federal law. The minimum size of the agricultural employer to be covered, or whether to have a separate Agricultural Workers Labor Relations Act. And then the minimum size of the agricultural employer to be covered. The State Labor Relations Act applies to employers with 5 or more. There was a lot of discussion last spring about, well, does 5 really make sense? Should it be 10? How do we count them? Because if you have an employer that has seasonal surges, are you counting the average number of employees? You're counting the number of employees that are there during the seasonal surge. That could create major differences for some employers. Whether and if so, how to differentiate between covered employers based on size. So there was also discussion of what if we provided multi-tiered bargaining, so limited bargaining with small farms, more comprehensive bargaining with larger farms, and then where would you draw that line? How do you differentiate if you go down that road? The minimum number of employees who may form a bargaining unit. This is a big issue potentially too. Bargaining unit of 1 definitely doesn't make sense. But do you allow bargaining units with less than 5 employees? Or do you require bargaining units to have at least the number of employees that's equal to like the minimum size of the employer covered.
Damien, the bargaining unit,
Mhm.
correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't does a bargaining unit have to be all the same employer or just same industry, but can be spread over a larger?
Well, so that's another thing we'll get into is there is some precedent for multi-employer bargaining. So for example, I believe in Barrie at one point, and it may still be the case that there's a stonecutters union that represents the workers in multiple shops. And then they all bargain with their sort of array of employers for similar benefits so that the employers benefit because there's not competition stealing employees away. The employees benefit because they're sort of bargaining on a larger basis and maybe they're bargaining for things in general. You may want to specify whether or not that's permitted. And I don't know enough about the agricultural sector to know if that would make sense. Most often in collective bargaining, you see one employer, one group of employees, and potentially one employer and multiple bargaining units. So you could imagine, well, the state, for example, there's non-management employees, there's supervisory employees, corrections employees have their own bargaining unit, judicial employees have their own bargaining unit and a separate bargaining law. And then there are other groups out there within state employees that have smaller bargaining units, state police, for example, unique set of issues, unique workplace, and separate bargaining unit. Within agricultural work, again, I don't know enough about the area to know how likely it would be that you would have a Vermont farm where you might have two bargaining units that have separate enough interests that they would want us bargain separately, or where you might have a group of farms in a region that might want to bargain collectively. But these would be things that you probably would want to hear from advocates on whether it makes sense, or whether that it introduces unnecessary complication or unintended consequences.
And I apologize for not running my question through you.
That's quite all right. All right, we're pausing though, any other questions at the moment? As we're going through this, I'm realizing this is a long charge. I'd forgotten how much there was in here. And I think that if anybody's feeling like already overwhelmed with it, I think it might be helpful once we've, at the end of the day, and maybe at the beginning of the next meeting, we'll go back and we'll look at the charge. I think it'll make a lot more sense after having had some of the background material that I know you're going to be getting to in a few minutes. So.
Yeah, and this is all posted on the website too, if you want to look at it again while you're thinking back. And I'm happy to discuss this with you. I'm always available by email or phone, or to set up a Zoom call or something like that. If you want to discuss something that you want clarification on, you want to run some thoughts past me, that sort of thing. I'm always available, and hopefully by the end of September, we'll have a second attorney who will be your new labor and employment attorney next year, who will be joining me to help out with the committee. And if we have specific ag law questions, we have Mike O'Grady from our office who's available. So there are other resources too, if the questions get out of my depth, which once we get into agricultural law, I'll be out of my depth almost immediately. So I'm comfortable with the collective bargaining and employment stuff, but once we get into the regulations that farms are dealing with on a daily basis on their production side, I'm just not an expert there, and I'm happy to get in Mike O'Grady to help with that. Another question is, how do you address seasonal, migratory, and temporary workers? This is a unique issue that agriculture faces. For example, fruit production, you may be bringing in a workforce that's there for a few weeks while your crops are bearing fruit. In other areas, you may be bringing in people for planting or other things, and they may be coming and going. You also have issues of temporary workers here who are on an H-2A visa, and agriculture crews that go from farm to farm and provide a specific service. So there are multiple questions that you'll need to consider, and we'll start touching on those today, but this is a particularly big question. One thing we can do at a future meeting too is look at how the 14 other states that do have agricultural collective bargaining deal with some of these issues. So you can look at some models to think about, well, what makes sense and does that make sense for Vermont? Because again, some of those states, California, Arizona, New York, are just very different agricultural environments than Vermont. Procedures for selecting and certifying an exclusive representative. This is exclusive representative is a fancy way of saying the union that represents the bargaining unit. Mandatory subjects for bargaining, so things they have to bargain about. We usually set those out in law, wages, conditions of employment, etc. Procedures for resolving bargaining impasse, including whether to permit strikes or to permit the farm to impose a contract. Unfair labor practices, so basically defining when someone has broken the rules. And we'll talk about what that looks like and what the actual consequences for committing an unfair labor practice are. They are generally not punitive consequences, but rather a remedy that seeks to get everyone back to the status quo so they can move forward. The role of the Vermont Labor Relations Board, if any, in administering the law, whether to provide state resources to assist parties during the process, determining a bargaining unit, certifying a union, negotiating a contract, and resolving bargaining impasse. So this was a big issue that again came up when this issue was discussed. How do small farms that are stretched very thin, or small groups of workers who are earning low wages and don't have the resources to hire a lawyer, how do those two groups deal with the costs of bargaining? And should the state provide resources to enable that to happen so that the groups are not, both sides are not facing an issue where they simply lack the resources to do an effective job and represent themselves? So that came up in discussion. So that'll be a question that you do need to address. You can also answer, no, don't provide state resources. And then any other issues the committee deems appropriate. That's just catch-all for anything that comes up while you're working on this. And that's it. So I am 2 minutes late. Sorry about that.
We started late.
There you go.
So no, you have no reason, no need to apologize. Okay, so any immediate questions on the charge? I know everyone is taking a summer day to be here. We are conscious of the fact that we all have busy lives. Particularly during the fall of every other year, even number of years is even more busy for some people. So we'll be thinking about when we need to meet again. We'll come back to that later in the day. I think part of what you pointed out was we will be wrapping up on December 15th. Is that right, Damien? So
yeah, that's the deadline for the report. So in an ideal world, everything is wrapped up before December 15th. In an election year world, the reality is we may be running up tight against that deadline. But there is a prevailing preference for December 15th report date so that the report is available before we start the session. So that's why we wrote it like that.
And recognizing that we also have a major holiday, maybe more than one major holiday actually between now and then, even after Election Day, not thinking of Election Day as a major holiday, but there's that as well. I think we'll probably be able to sort of backload our meeting schedule a little bit and not have a heavier schedule maybe after the 1st of November. Okay, we're at a point where we could pause and take a break. If the committee wants to keep going, I know we feel like we barely got started. Damien, would it make sense to launch into the first presentation and then we could, after a little while, we could stop and stretch?
Sure. Whatever works for you. I'm happy to push ahead and just go until you're ready to stop. Whatever works.
I think let's plan on taking a break. I think it's helpful not to be sitting in a chair for an hour and 45 minutes without a chance to get up and stretch anyway. So why don't we go ahead and see where we are in 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes.
All right. Well, I will pull up the second presentation here. Right. So overview of employment laws. I apologize for the very boring PowerPoint presentation. I don't have any fun graphics or anything like that. I just didn't have time to put them together. I will try to make this one more interesting than the last one though. So as a quick outline, I'm going to start with wage and hour law, minimum wage, overtime. I'm going to move on to child labor, which is an interesting one for agriculture, and occupational safety and health. Then I'm going to move on to discrimination protections, which is where we start to really see divergence between the state and federal law and other workplace protections, workers' compensation, which is a state issue, unemployment insurance, which is its own strange state federal beast, and then a couple related federal laws that I'm just going to give a quick overview of. I want to say that the two federal laws I'm going to touch on, which are the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act, that is a mouthful, and the H-2A visa program, are huge. So we are going to be doing like the 100,000-foot level overview today. I've included some links that Megan has posted or some documents that Megan has posted that provide very brief sort of fact sheets for both of those programs. These are the sort of like high level fact sheets, and you can go much deeper. So if you want more material on that, I have literally probably a ream of material I can send you just from the federal government, not even touching on the advocacy groups, because both programs have their complications and headaches and criticisms from pretty much all sides, I would say, as being either too burdensome, not protective enough, not effective, et cetera. So we'll touch on that briefly. But I did just want to note that that is a very, very brief overview. So for wage and hour laws, for Vermont, it's really simple. Agricultural work is just not covered. Agricultural work is expressly excluded from Vermont's minimum wage and overtime laws. You still have to pay your workers on time, but for purposes of minimum wage, Vermont minimum wage laws just don't apply. On the federal side, they are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act with a number of exemptions. So the minimum wage and overtime requirements do not apply under the federal law to certain small farms, and they measure it based on no more than 500 man days of labor in any calendar quarter in the past year. What does that mean? So a man day of labor, and you'll have to excuse the gendered language in the old federal law, but it's basically what it looks at is 1 hour or more of work by a person in a day. And so you're looking at basically, do you have 500 days total where you had multiple persons employed during your calendar quarter if you add up each day for those workers? So worker A worked 60 days, basically let's say you had 10 workers who worked 60 different days in the quarter, you qualify. And you're now covered. But if you had 10 workers who only worked 30 days, you're not covered. Does that make sense? So you'd be at 300 man days under the second. You'd be at 600 man days under the first as they measure it. Doesn't matter the number of hours in those days. It's just looking at how many, if you count up the days that each employee worked, how many days did you get to?
So this is federal law.
This is federal, and this is your first exemption. If you're below this threshold, minimum wage and overtime don't apply. So that's the $7.25 minimum wage, and then time and a half for hours over 40 work week.
Thinking like, so a quarter is 90 days roughly.
Yeah.
And if you're 13 weeks. So you
Yeah.
can sort of think about how many, if you had, somebody working 5 days a week or 6 days a week, how many
Right.
laborers would we be talking about? Yeah.
Yeah. So 5 days a week, you're looking at about 65 days. 6 days a week, you're looking at about 78 days, give or take. So thinking about that in terms of 8-hour days, assuming you're actually working 8-hour shifts and not a longer shift, then you can kind of see you're looking at farms that are roughly have 8 to 12 staff people. So smaller farms, you're going to notice this theme. Smaller farms are consistently excluded from coverage. And that's a consistent theme throughout employment laws. When there are exclusions, it's usually small farms. And then there are a couple of other interesting ones here. So immediate family members, your spouse, children, and parents who live on the farm with you. And then they say, and other immediate family members in the same household. So potentially you have a sibling who's, stayed at home and works on the farm. Minimum wage and overtime don't apply. It's just the understanding that if it's the family farm, you might be working 60, 80, 90 hours during certain seasons, and you're not entitled to overtime for that.
I'm interested in the definition of a farm. For example, can you take a given property and treat as a farm the portion of the farm that grows, that property that grows crops? Another portion of the property could be a separate LLC or corporation, deals with animals. Could they be treated as, are dealt with as a single farm, or can they be considered multiple farms by the way they're legally structured?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure how USDOL deals with multiple business entities. I think to some extent, there is going to be a question of, are you structuring this so you're breaking it down to deliberately avoid the law, or are these actually functioning as separate entities? But I would need to do more research on how they've actually enforced the law. I'm sure that at some point someone has thought to split up their entities to avoid jurisdiction. And I'm sure that they've got some guidance on that, but I just don't know.
Again, when you get to it, I think
what's up.
that's something that would be of interest to us.
Great. Let me, I'm gonna have a separate document here where I'm just taking notes on questions to answer. So if you see me stop sharing of the screen and pop this up, it just means that I will work on that answer for you.
And I see Representative Chestnut Tangerine has a hand up too.
So for broad purposes, is our definition of farm 50% of income is produced farm?
So that's another interesting one. It's going to vary by statute. There are different statutes that look at different production levels for income. And they also they will, depending on the statute, they define different things as being included in the farm. So for purposes of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which I may also refer to as the FLSA, the definition of agriculture, just pull this up here. All right. Includes farming in all of its branches, and among other things, the cultivation and tillage of soil, dairying, the production, cultivation, growing, and harvesting of any agricultural or horticultural commodity, raising of livestock, bees, fur-bearing animals, or poultry, and any practices, including forestry or lumbering, performed by a farmer or on a farm as an incident to or in conjunction with the farming operations, including preparation for market, delivery to storage or to market, or to carriers for transportation to market. It does not include, for example, actually producing the commodity or the product that you might sell, so the finished product. But it then gets, let me just see if we have a definition of farm. Don't have a specific definition of farm. We do have a definition of, let's see. Oh, yeah. And then that's it for the definitions there. There's more discussion when we get out into additional exceptions of things that are excluded. But that gives you a sense, it's a pretty broad definition of agriculture. But they read it broadly, but not to include things like, say you produce fruit and then you have a canning factory down the road. The canning factory is not considered agriculture. That's considered other work. And that is definitely subject to Fair Labor Standards Act and probably minimum wage. Again, this is where definitions matter. And it's, again, going to vary from law to law. So, but the questions, like your question raises an interesting issue. If you have your canning facility on the premises and workers are spending 60% of their time out harvesting, and then after the harvest is done, they come in and they produce cider and other products, applesauce, something like that. How is it dealt with? And I really need to just do more research. You can see there, the complications are endless potentially, and they'll change from operation to operation because different farms are going to do different things. So things we see in Vermont, maple sugaring, that's specifically exempted, by the way. The dairy, though, if you produce your own milk on the farm rather than shipping to, say, a creamery that then turns it into, then pasteurizes and bottles it, your own yogurt, etc. All of these things can create complications for the farmer. So I will do more research into that and see if I can create a sort of succinct way of mapping this out. But I do want to warn you right now that these laws just create sort of a thicket where it's very hard to tell what applies when you have all of these different branches of law overlapping, and it's hard to see where the roots are for everything. I don't know if that metaphor works, but that's what I'm going with right now. So, all right. So immediate family members of the farmer are excluded. Certain seasonal hand harvest workers paid on a piece rate basis are excluded too. We can delve into this a little bit more if you want to, but basically a piece rate basis is where you're picking a product and they look at how much you pick and they pay you based on how much you pay. So that's what we're looking at. So say berries or something like that, where instead of harvesting with a rake or some sort of mechanized harvester, you're actually going out and you're picking the individual berries. And then maybe you get paid by the bushel or something like that. Children under 16 who work on the same farm as their parent and are employed as hand harvest workers on a piece rate basis. This is where we start to get into the interesting child labor law exemptions for farms. So basically, if you're a minor and you go with your parent to work in the fields during the harvest, you're exempt from minimum wage and overtime. And then employees engaged in the range production of livestock. These are your cowboys, cowgirls, and other folks who may be doing production of livestock out on a ranch or something like that. Not something that I think we see much of in Vermont, if we see it at all. But I stand to be corrected there. And then separately, there's a group where minimum wage applies, but overtime doesn't. And so this is anyone in agriculture. And then they also say irrigation. So again, this is something that's more likely to be an issue out west, but we may see some of that here in Vermont. Livestock auctions are excluded from overtime. Small country elevators. I don't know how many of these we have in Vermont, if any. You definitely see them where I was last week in the Midwest. These are grain elevators with 5 or fewer employees. The understanding being that during harvest time, those employees are working around the clock. And so requiring overtime, they thought it made sense to give an exemption. Processing maple sap into sugar or syrup. So during sugaring season, no overtime is required. And then transportation or preparation for transportation of fruits and vegetables to the place of first processing or first marketing within the same state. So this could include the folks who clean, package, and process products to go to like a farmer's market, as well as products that are going to the place where they're going to be packaged, bottled, et cetera.
Representative Chester Tangeman.
Is within the same state, so it doesn't trigger interstate commerce?
It's interestingly, it's federal law. So it does cover interstate commerce. But I think the within the same state is intended to focus on the smaller local producers rather than a larger interstate operation. But it does raise questions that are interesting for our farmers on the borders. So if you have someone down in your area of Vermont who maybe is going across to New York to deliver their milk to a creamery there rather than going to a creamery in Vermont. Unfortunately, this is federal law, so there's nothing we can do to change that if we think it's not a good fit for Vermont. But it is something to keep in the back of your head if you decide to recommend a change to Vermont's wage and hour laws. So there are already points where the federal minimum wage of $7.25 applies, but the overtime doesn't.
This FLSA is specifically fruits and vegetables, so then like dairy processing.
Oh, you're good point. Yes, dairy and meat are not the same. So this would be someone delivering their apples across the state to a place that makes cider or across state lines.
I mean, I know, and I don't want to get off track, but I know there's been a shortage of Vermont slaughterhouses, so farmers in my area take their animals to New York.
Yeah.
So would that's not covered under this?
That's not covered under this exemption. So those transportation individuals would be subject to overtime. The individuals raising the livestock are not subject to overtime because they fall under the agriculture exemption. And folks who maybe fall under both, you start to get into complicated questions, and you may have individuals who are subject to the exemption for certain work, but not for other work. So you work raising the pigs most of the time, but periodically you drive the pigs across state lines to the nearest slaughterhouse. If that puts you over 40, you may be subject to overtime for those hours. But again, that gets into another complicated area. If you want to delve into that, we can in the future. You may find that there are so many complicated areas here. There's just a few you want to focus on. Other questions? Okay,
Maybe we'll pause here,
great.
just for a short break then. So let's see what time it is, 11:08. How about 10 minutes?